Hey everybody, Drew Dinkmeyer from Established Run here. And in today's advanced users tutorial, I'm going to walk you through how to use the optimizer from the good folks at the Solver to create better DFS NBA lineups using some of the tricks and tips that I use when creating my own DFS lineups for mass multi-entry. Let's get to it. All right, first and foremost, the thing that I want to stress most about using an optimizer is simply a tool to help you create lineups under the rules and constraints that you're setting. For most people, they think of an optimizer in the context of it's a tool that can help get me the right answers to the test. And I think that's sort of a mistaken way to look at things, because yes, the right answers to the test may be within the ways to utilize the optimizer tool in itself, but really what you're trying to do is use the tool to come up with lineups that look like you want them to look like in a portfolio of lineups. If you simply optimize off of projections alone, you'll get the same lineups with like one or two players different all the way throughout. If you create a bunch of different rules, you'll get more differentiation from lineups. In NFL, you might consider stacking. In NBA, you might consider limiting a number of players from a certain team. All these different rules are meant to be different levers and tools at your disposal to make lineups that correlate with what you have in your head and what you think are going to be good lineups to compete on the slate. A lot of people mistakenly look at the Solver or any optimizer as if the answers are inside them, and if I just set the right settings, I will print money. That's not the way to think through using an optimizer. So let's start there. Now, in this tutorial, I'm going to walk through a number of the features in the advanced settings on the Solver that I use, and I'm going to walk through some settings that also I don't use as frequently, but let you know how you can use them to help construct your lineups. And the first thing that I want to highlight with the Solver is the projections. If you are an Established Run NBA subscriber, you will get projections from Established Run automatically uploaded into the Solver. However, you can, of course, upload your own projection files here. If you have your own projections or use a different provider's projections, so on and so forth, the Solver has the customizability to upload your own projections. So projections are the first part of the puzzle. The next part of the puzzle for me is variance. And on the Solver, they come with some default levels of variance that you can use. You don't have to use these. You can use your own variance. You can use no variance at all. But what is variance? Variance is simply a tool that allows you to differentiate lineups. So for example, if I was to run 100 lineups with 0 variance, the default level of variance you can see over here is 0. You would see a lot of overlapping players in those 100 lineups. You'd see certain players that are used in all of the lineups because the lineups are just differentiating by 1 or 2 players in each time, because this is the optimal lineup in terms of differentiation. There's no change in projection for any of these players. It's just filtering through the top 100 lineups. Now, this might be what you want if you just want to play the projections. But what you will end up with is a very concentrated lineup set portfolio. In this case, 100% Kobe White, 93% Giannis, 80% Anthony Edwards, 75% Ayo Dosunmu. Those 4 players are in almost every lineup. And you can see the differentiation in these lineups. This lineup, for example, has a differentiation of Taurean Prince here versus Javon Carter here. Every other player is the same. And so if you only have, if you have 100 lineups that you're building, do you want 2 of those lineups to be nearly identical? That's a decision for you to make. Variance can help still have you systematically tied to the projections, but pick a different number within those projections to use for each lineup that it creates. For example, if you were to set these lineup variances at, let's say, 10% for every single player here, 10% variance simply means that the player's projection would be increased or decreased by 10%. In this case with Giannis, let's say his projection was 66 points. 10% of 66 is 6.6 points. So 10% up would be 72.6 points. 10% down would be 59.4 DraftKings points. In this instance, when you're using variance, it's simply selecting a random number between that 59.4 and that 72.6 each time it goes to create a lineup. And what does this do? Well, let's put some variance on and let's show. So we'll use ETR'S recommended variance in this case. This is from a proprietary formula. It just has to do with ceiling relative to projection. And you can see the variance is lower on the highly projected players, and it gets a little bit higher as you go down to the lower projected players. The lower projected players having more volatility in their role, the higher projected players having more stability in their role. But let's produce 100 lineups here, and let's keep an eye on this portfolio in terms of the exposures. And you'll see instead of the 100% on Kobe White, now we're down to 88%. Instead of the 90% on Giannis, we're down to 82, and so on and so forth. It spreads things out a little bit from a portfolio perspective. And you can choose, you can choose to use these defaults, and you can always see what the variance is in this column. One of the other things I love about the solver is you can move columns around. You can just move stuff to wherever you want it in terms of the visual of how you like to look at things. But you can see in the variance column what the associated variance is. And if you don't want to use these, you just go to the default setting and you can choose to have variance by position as well. In some sports, this is really helpful to have variance by position. In NBA, it's really not, because a lot of players are multi-position eligible. And so I never use this. But I do use this sometimes in like NFL, where I might want to put higher variance levels on defense than I do on running backs or different positions like that. But this is a way you can do it if you want to use something other than the default. I use variance every single night, and I'm often using the ETR recommended level of variance. But sometimes if I find that it's making my portfolios not as spread out as I'd like, I will increase the variance by using a default and using a generic number for everybody across. The benefits of the ETR variance or the solver recommended variances is they are adjusted relative to the actual projection of the player. So like I said before, the lower projected player often has a higher level of variance associated, which means you naturally get a little bit more spread out positions among the cheaper players, which I find useful as well. Sometimes on a night where I really like the cheap player, I might make a decision where I change their variance individually. That's something you can do here as well. You can just change a player's variance individually if you want to, or I might like lock the player in lineups or so on and so forth. Different ways to try to, again, figure out what I want in my head in my lineups and how I'm telling the optimizer to try to create lineups that represent what I'm thinking in my head for creating a portfolio. Okay, let's get into some of the rules in the advanced settings within the solver that you can use, and I'll highlight the ones that I use regularly when thinking about using an optimizer. Let's start off in this setting here in the roster spot, where you can change salary cap restrictions up or down in terms of min or max salary cap to use. For me in NBA, I'm often using around this 98, 99 threshold. I'm really not leaving a lot of salary in NBA. Pricing is fairly efficient on the whole. There's occasionally exceptions on really small slates where there's a lot of players out, there's a lot of value. I might remove these kind of constraints, but generally I want my lineups to use nearly all of the salary cap. Pricing is generally efficient. In some other sports, like XFL or some other things where the pricing is very inefficient, you might create a much wider salary threshold that you'd allow. And in some sports where you're trying, or some contests where you're trying to prevent yourself from creating a lineup that is duplicated by others, you might do things where you lower the salary maximum. So you're making sure your lineups are leaving salary, because research has shown that lineups that do leave salary are a little bit more unique than lineups that do not. I used to do this a lot in NFL Showdown in the early days, just as a way to create unique lineups. Don't do it as much anymore. Have other ways to go about doing that. But again, it's a route that you can use to do that. Now let's talk about unique players. Unique players is simply the number of players different within each lineup that's created. And as I showed in the first set of lineups we created with 0 variance, you could have one player different in each lineup and things be really tight on the whole in terms of your overall player portfolio. So unique players is actually another way to create differentiation in your lineups. And it can be used similarly to variance. It's different in terms of the way that it does it. In this instance, this is forcing different players into each lineup. You may sacrifice some projection to doing that, whereas variance is kind of shuffling up the projections a little bit within a range, right? Within a range for each player, 10 to 15, 20%, 30% on cheaper players, so on and so forth. And it's picking a number within that range. This is saying we're keeping the projection exactly the same if there's no variance on it, but we're forcing 2 new players, or 3 or 4 or 5. I do not use unique players. almost never. I'd rather use variance for me personally to create differentiation in my lineup than forcing differentiation through different players. Max lineup ownership constraints. I will use this in golf. I will use this in NFL. I rarely use it in NBA, but you can set a total ownership constraint on the lineup as a whole. This would simply be summing up the individually projected ownership of every player individually in the lineup, summing it up and giving a cumulative number that fits below whatever number you put in here. The reason I don't do it in NBA as much is very simply ownership projections in NBA can change dramatically based on news really late in the slate or even after lock when other sites aren't updating things. And I don't find ownership to be particularly helpful in those situations. And thus, I don't put constraints on. You certainly can, but it's not the way that I choose to build things personally. You can also choose to have max player exposure. So you can see this is at 100%. You can say, hey, I don't want more than 40% of any player in any one player in all of my lineups. You can say I don't want more than 20, whatever the number is, right? And this again is a risk tolerance question. You know, are you comfortable having 100% of a player in your lineups if you create a framework that allows that? I'm fine with it. I don't use this, but I also use variance and other things that rarely get me to 100% of a player in any lineup. You can also change this positionally as well. You can also have this applied after each lineup or for number of lineups in the run as a whole. And you can say this, you can see this is just calculating the player's exposure, that it's reaching that threshold either after each lineup, like where are they in the total, or after a requested number of lineups to create. So it can lead to, as the tutorial says, this will typically lead to high projected players showing early in optimal lineups before their max exposure percentage is reached. And then once they hit that threshold that they're reached, they don't show up as much in later lineups. This is why I don't generally use max player exposures or minimum player exposures. You have the ability to create minimum player exposures as well in here. On the solver, where you can create a min percentage that you want of each player. I don't do that either, because generally, if it's a poorly projected player that you're just forcing in, they're going to get into your last like 5 lineups anyway. It's much better to just change the projection to manage the projection to whatever you want, and then the player will be more appropriately represented within your portfolio. So I do not use min or max player exposures personally, but the levers are there for you to pull should you choose. We talked about variance by position. You also have the ability to choose which flex positions you want getting in the flex spot. In this case on DraftKings. So whether you want point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, center, if there's a specific position you think is really weak on a given slate, you don't want to use it in flex spots, you can do so there. You can also choose that on guard or forward slots. I don't do it very much because in NBA, a lot of guys are multi-positional eligibility. So I almost never use this. I sometimes will use this in NFL with like tight ends and flex or different things like that, but it's always dependent on pricing and different slates, different features I use. Okay, stacking. In the NBA, I never use this, but this allows you to create stacks if you wanted. So if you want to create a rule where you have either positively correlated players, like a point guard with at least one center from the same team, you think they're positively correlated, all your lineups, you want that, you can create that in here. You can also do it to like negatively correlate situations. So, if I have a point guard from a team, I want exactly 0 other point guards from the same team. You can do it. You can do things like that to negatively correlate. So the stacks and the positions is just creating rules that are a framework for your lineups relative to the positions. Like I said, I do not use this. I use this very, very rarely. Team level, you can create stacks by basically forcing players from a certain team. I don't use this. If I want to have a minimum exposure to a team, I'll use it in another area, which we'll show here in the restrictions. I just use it in the team setting where I'd say, okay, I want min 1 Chicago player on this slate or something like that. But you can do it in the force section as well. Okay, let's get into the restrictions. Positional stuff. Again, you can use at least one point guard from the same team, at least one shooting guard from the same team, different things like that. Again, I don't use this very often at all. Stats by lineup. This occasionally I will use in NBA. If it's a really chalky slate and I'm having a hard time with the projections differentiating from my opponents, I might create a rule that says I want at least one, and in this case, I'll just add all the positions. But if I had, let's say I liked point guards. I wanted to differentiate at point guard on the slate, right? I thought the point guard chalk was bad on the slate. I want to find a way to differentiate. I might say at least one point guard where ownership is less than 8%, right? Now, all my lineups will create with at least one point guard eligible player that has a projected ownership less than 8%. That's a way that you can force your ability to get unique on the lineup. You could also say, at least 5 of all the positions, right? So you make all the positions possible here. If you wanted a lineup that made sure you were getting guys that were going to play a lot, right? That they have minutes greater than 30, right? You can do things like that. I don't do those types of rules. I kind of just let the projections, plenty of players, like if a player, these are arbitrary endpoints to me. So if a player had 29 minutes projected, now I'm not including them. I'd rather just include them. So I don't use those types of rules outside of ownership percentage, where sometimes I will use this stats by lineup to make sure that I create a situation where I have a unique player in each lineup. Now, stats by team, you can do this as well, where if you're forcing players in from a team, you could say I want at least one point guard where the projection is greater than 30 from Chicago. Right? I don't use this almost never, but the tool is there at your disposal. If you want to create rules where by team they're getting into each of your lineups and so on and so forth. And then these team restrictions, which I do use frequently, I will often manage the high end in terms of the number of players I'd want on a roster. Sometimes I'll do it globally where I'll say, okay, I want max 3 players from all the teams on the roster. And then sometimes I'll choose individual teams where I want to make sure, okay, there's so much value on this team tonight. I want to make sure I get at least one of those players in every single one of my lineups. So I will use this section frequently on the team side of things. But I think it's important to understand you're just setting the framework for what your lineups that you create will look like. In this case, for me, I'm guaranteeing that I get a Chicago player in every single lineup. Or if I think a team just doesn't have anybody that I want to use at all, I don't need to X out their players from my player pool. I can just say, 0 Suns. I don't want any Suns in my lineups. Now, of course, as always, the more rules you create, the more constraints you create, the longer it will take to optimize your lineups. With the solver, which is very fast, it will still go very quick with most rules that you can create. But you could also run into a situation where if you create a lot of rules and you overly constrain the optimizer, it's too constrained to actually create the lineups. And so I try to be very precise on any rule that I'm making. And often when I'm making rules, and I'm making lots of rules, I will run the optimizer after each rule that I create to make sure that it can run. Because if I create 30 different rules or different things, different levers that I've pulled, and I then go to run and it gives me an error message, we can't create these lineups because you have these different rules on, I might not know which rule it is. And I might spend a bunch of time trying to figure out which one. So oftentimes, each time I create a rule, I'll run the optimizer to make sure that it'll work. In this instance, I've done all of this for this slate. This is a past slate, so I won't be doing that tonight. Player groups, this is where I live. This is where I live for NBA. And for advanced NBA optimizer users, I think this is a good place for you to live and learn as well. And this is an area where I will make a bunch of rules. And the way that I will go about doing so is I personally will go kind of team by team with min-max situations. So what I will often do is, in this case, let's say on this slate, I'll look at the Chicago Bulls roster as a whole. I see a lot of different values here. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to think of which players are most likely to eat into each other's ceiling to a point that I don't want to play them together. And that changes for each slate. Some slates I might allow 2 players together that I won't allow on the next slate because of slate size, because of depth of value at these positions. So it's really trying to figure out, for me, what different combinations of players are unlikely to all appear in the winning lineup together. And in this case with Chicago, I might do something where it's max one of or max two of their guard options on this slate. Even though these are all great values, I might want just two of them. I might not want Kobe White, Ayo Dosunmu, and Zach LaVine all together in the same lineup. Something like that would be a rule for me. I might say I don't want Nikola Vucevic and Andre Drummond in the same lineup together for me because they're both centers. Drummond is his backup. He largely will see increased minutes when Vucevic gets hurt or in foul trouble or different things. I don't need them in the same lineup together. I don't see a path for upside between the two of them together. These are the different types of rules I will create and go by each team and go through each team and make rules to be able to help create a better framework for the lineups that I'm creating. So we'll leave some of these rules. We'll run some at the end. But generally, I would do that for every team on the slate. And some examples of rules that I would do for like a Clippers team that has two really high-priced players in Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, on a 10-game slate, would never play them together. Would always make a rule that's max one of Paul George or max one of Kawhi Leonard. We talk about these rules frequently on Behind the Paywall on the Establish the Show premium shows that we do Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. to 6 p.m., breaking down each slate. We talk through some of the rules that we would implement in an optimizer. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about these types of rules. But on a 3-game slate, I might be more open to playing the two of them together. Depends on how many other star players that are on this slate and different things like that. But these are the types of rules I'm trying to think through. The other thing that I will do sometimes is, let's say, so there's some if-then statements that you can do. And these are great because you can create rules for the lineups based on the players that are in them. So this will say any lineup that contains Giannis, because I'm paying so much of my salary to Giannis. He's over 12K on this slate, and he has to score so many points to be able to be valuable. I want at most one of Drew Holiday or Brook Lopez in the same lineup. Or I could say I want at most one other Buck in the same lineup, and I can just add in all the Bucks that are in my player pool, right? And that's basically me saying, look, I can have 3 Bucks together in a lineup, but not with Giannis, because Giannis needs to take up so many of the points, has to score so many of the points for him to be worth his price tag, that I'm not thinking there's going to be enough points for other Bucks players available. Those are different types of rules. So this is an if-then that says if it contains this player, right? You can do ones that if they don't contain Giannis, well, then I want at least one of these Bucks. You can do stuff like that, right? And these are advanced settings that I will use on occasion, especially when I want to specifically attack one team in a very specific way. These are great rules. You can also have so these are hard and fast rules, meaning if the lineup doesn't contain this person, it's putting in these guys, one of these guys, or 2 of these guys, or whatever rules you set here. Or if it does contain, it's including at least one other, or it's including exactly 0, or whatever. They're hard and fast rules, right? But you can change these as well to boost. This is fun, right? You can say, okay, if the lineup doesn't contain Giannis, I want all these guys to their projection to be boosted by 10%. So instead of Drew Holiday's base projection being, in this case, let's see, where do we have his projection? His base projection being 41.7. It's going to be used at 41.7 in every lineup that Giannis is in. But if Giannis has not been chosen for a lineup, now we're using 45.2, right? We're just 10% higher. And that's going to get Drew into more lineups that Giannis is not in. You can also do dock stuff. So you can say, if the lineup contains Giannis, dock these guys by 10% with their projection. And what that's saying is it's not creating the hard and fast rule, but it's saying, like, I don't want these players together as much. And I will use this often. I generally use 5 to 10% in the docks and the boosts. If you want to be more aggressive, you can be more aggressive. But what I'm trying to do when I'm using these types of if-then statements is I'm trying to shy away from players that might be heavily correlated together, but they might impact their ceilings on the whole. So like on this slate, I might do this with Kobe White and Ayo Dosunmu. Were two cheap Bulls guards that were great values on this slate. I'll show their value scores in a second. But I might say, hey, any lineup that contains Kobe White, because these two guys are just going to show up in so many lineups together when they're this highly valued on a small slate. Let's dock this projection on Dosunmu a little bit. Let's try to separate them when we're going to use them a little bit. Now, when I'm making this type of rule, I'm naturally choosing to get less of Ayo Dosunmu because I'm saying in lineups that include Kobe White, we're using a lower projection. But in lineups that don't include Kobe White, we're using the normal projection. So I'm choosing less of Dosunmu because if I didn't have this rule, it would allow them to play together a lot, right? And I'll still allow them to play together, but it's going to happen less frequently because of the rule that I've created here. So this is an area that I use often to sort of go through and create rules and groups to help create my portfolio set. As always, you can also control your player pool in terms of who you want in, who you want out on the solver. That's all customizable as well. As with the projections in all of these areas, you can customize any of the inputs. It's a wonderful tool to help you make lineups that are more representative of what you're thinking on a given slate. And you can see, we'll show the differences. We'll pay attention to Ayo Dosunmu's portfolio exposure. So we have ETR volatility. We have those rules on. We're going to create 100 lineups. And then we're going to take the rules off, and we're going to see how it impacts Ayo Dosunmu's player exposure in terms of how much of him we get in these lineups. So you can see that was really fast, right? Even with the rules. 100 lineups created. I've got 29% Dosunmu with these rules on. But if I take these rules off, and you just take the rules off by unchecking. I take these rules off, and then I re-optimize. Let's see how much more Dosunmu I get in these lineups. You can see this number is starting to get elevated already, right? So I had 29% before, now I have 48%. So you can see all of these tools and levers that you have at your disposal to pull are things that can help you create better lineups. I just realized I skipped over one area, and it's a cool new feature that the solver added. It's one that a lot of times with the solver, I ask for these to be added, but in this case, it was one they came up with on their own. But you can choose a certain number of players from a certain start time, and I love this rule. So on this slate in particular, there's a 7:30 game, an 8 o'clock game, and a 10 o'clock game. So if you wanted to use a certain number of players from a specific game, you could just say at least 2 players from the 8 o'clock game. Where this rule is very, very helpful is on nights where there's late news, there's a bunch of questionable tags, there's a couple late games, and you want to leave yourself flexibility to be able to swap later. You can say, hey, I want at least 3 players in all my lineups from the 10 o'clock games. Now, if there were 10:30 games, you'd add them too, so you could include both time sets. But that gives you the flexibility in every lineup to be able to late swap. And late swap is another really cool tool and feature that the solver allows you to mess around with. So like in this instance, I'm creating room for my lineups to have players from the late games. And then when that news breaks later, I can go into the late swap tab. I can upload lineups into this tab here, and it will show all the lineups that I have. Right now, the slate has already locked and all the games have already locked. So I don't think this would be beneficial, but we could do that. And I could go through and upload these here, and then I can swap and re-optimize them based on the new information that I have, the new projections that I have, which if you are an ETR subscriber, they will continue to update throughout lock periods all night long with news and relevant information. And the late swap tools, really, really helpful. Probably will create a separate tutorial to walk through the late swap on a live slate, so I can show that as well. But this is what I want to walk through. It's a little bit lengthier to get through these advanced settings, but this, as an advanced NBA Optimizer user, these are the things that I use each and every slate. And I wanted to make sure I shared them with you and highlighted these great tools and features that you can use at the Solver to help improve the portfolio of lineups you're creating each and every night. And remember, whenever you're using an optimizer, you're doing it to try to help you create lineups quicker for the framework of lineups that you want to build. It's not a slot machine. It doesn't have the winning combinations in there if you just press the right buttons. But what it can do is help take whatever is in your brain when you're thinking of ways to create lineups and help create a framework for that and then quickly generate lineups under that framework. That's how you should use an optimizer. That's how the advanced users in NBA DFS use optimizers. All right, that'll do it for myself, Drew Dinkmeyer from Establish a Run, highlighting the Advanced Users NBA tutorial. Thanks to the good folks at the Solver for creating an incredible product. It's very easy to use, very fast to generate lineups, and my preferred optimizer when playing NBA DFS.